Hey there, brother friends and sister friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Heart Set Above podcast, a space where we seek to keep our hearts anchored in the things of God while we learn to navigate life in a world that is so far from Eden. In this series, we've strived to save you thousands in therapy by going over a therapeutic model called Internal Family Systems, or IFS, which is a therapeutic lens that helps us understand the different parts of our inner world. It's a way of looking at our patterns of thinking and feeling and behaving with curiosity and compassion rather than judgment. In the previous episodes of this series, we've talked mostly about protector parts, those parts of us that try to keep us safe. And sometimes they do that in helpful ways, and sometimes their strategies become a little bit rigid or distorted over time. We also talked about how to identify those parts, how to get curious about them, and how to begin building trust with them by validating and having compassion for their experience. Today, we're going to take the next step. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to go a little bit deeper past our protector parts and begin connecting with those parts that they are protecting, or what IFS calls exiled parts. And so these are often the younger, more vulnerable parts of us that carry pain or fear or distorted beliefs that formed in moments when we were hurting and when we just didn't have the resources to process what happened. So if you're just joining us, I would encourage you to go back and listen to the earlier episodes in this series because we laid a lot of important groundwork there. But here's a quick recap. When we talk about parts, we're simply referring to patterns of thinking, behaving, and feeling. And parts often form in response to experiences in our lives, especially childhood experiences. And when we begin to get curious about those parts, we typically ask a few important questions. Things like, what is this part afraid of? What is this part trying to accomplish for me? Or what is it trying to protect me from? Because at the end of the day, all parts of us are trying to accomplish something very good. Essentially, every part wants to feel safe, feel loved, to feel protected, to not feel rejected, to not be abandoned, to not be afraid. The problem isn't usually the goal of our parts. The problem is often the strategy that they learn to try to reach that goal. So when we stop trying to ignore or bulldoze our protector parts and instead learn to really see our parts, to honor their fears and their pain, to validate their goal, even while disagreeing with their strategy, something remarkable happens. Our protector parts often soften. They begin to trust us. And when that happens, they sometimes allow us to go deeper, to connect with and care for the wounded parts that they've been protecting for so long. So in the last episode, I shared a personal example of a protector part that I've encountered in my own inner work. When I pictured this part in my internal meeting place, it appeared as a large boulder-like figure. It almost looked like the Thing from Fantastic Four. Massive, rock-like, hunched over with arms tightly crossed across its chest, heavy, guarded, impenetrable. And this protector part had one main strategy. Do not trust people. Stay guarded. Stay one step ahead. Don't rely on anyone too much, because if you do, you might get hurt again. And for a long time, other parts of me were frustrated with this protector. Parts that wanted connection, that wanted vulnerability, that wanted deeper intimacy with others. It was easy for those parts to get annoyed with this boulder-like protector part. And those parts would either try to ignore or overpower this Hulk-like protector. But once I learned to slow down and get curious about this protector, something began to shift. Instead of trying to push it away or argue with it, I just began to sit with it, to thank it, to validate what it was trying to do. It was trying to keep me safe. And over time, over many meetings in that internal space, this big, ominous protector part slowly began to soften. And eventually I got close enough to put my hand on its boulder-like shoulder as a sign of gratitude and camaraderie. And when I did, something surprising happened. the boulder protector slowly opened its arms. And inside those arms was a 7-year-old version of me that this protector part had been guarding for decades. And this protector was holding a younger part of me that carried the pain from a moment in my childhood when I felt deeply unprotected by my dad. Not because he did anything wrong, but because of how I interpreted that moment as a child. And that little 7-year-old part of me had come to believe something in that moment, a distortion formed out of the pain from that moment in my childhood. And that belief was this: I'm not lovable enough to be protected. And that belief was so painful that my inner system did what many systems do. It exiled that part. The pain of that moment got pushed down and tucked away, and then protector parts formed around that exiled part to keep that pain from ever being triggered again. You see, exiles are usually younger parts of us that carry grief or fear or shame or rejection, loneliness, or distorted beliefs about ourselves. These parts are often connected to specific memories or experiences where we felt a wound that we couldn't make sense of in that moment of our youth. And because the pain was too much to process at the time, our system essentially said, let's just put that over here where it won't hurt us anymore. But of course, the pain doesn't actually disappear. It just waits. And when something in our present life reminds us of that old pain, our protector parts jump in quickly to try to keep the exile from being triggered again. That's what that boulder-like protector was trying to do for me. It was trying to keep me from getting too close to anyone so that I wouldn't have to feel that pain again if someone failed to protect me in the way that I expected them to. Now, once we begin to uncover the deeper wounds that our protectors have been trying to guard, the next step is incredibly important, especially for those of us who follow Christ. Because once we begin to encounter these exiled parts, I think it's incredibly important, especially for Christians, to invite God into that space. Now, of course, God is welcome in every stage of this process. He can be present when we're meeting protector parts. He can be present in that meeting place. But when we arrive at an exile, that younger, wounded part of us, I believe it becomes especially powerful to invite God into that. Because often what these exiled parts needed most in that moment of pain from our past was often something only that God can ultimately provide. So once you encounter an exile, the first step is simply to see and understand it. Sometimes an exile is connected to a very specific memory, and sometimes it represents a pattern of experiences over time. But usually there's some kind of distortion that the exile carries, a belief that formed out of that pain. For example, I'm not lovable, or I'm too much, or I'm not worth protecting, or I'm going to be abandoned. For me, the distortion carried by that 7-year-old exile was, I'm not lovable enough to be protected. And as you continue to really see your exile, some helpful questions to ask are, what did this part need in that moment when the pain hit? Or what did they need to hear? What did they need someone to do for them? What did they need to be protected from? Now, a secular IFS therapist would typically say, once you identify the exile and understand its pain, you as the adult self can step in and provide what the younger part needed. You might hold the younger part or comfort them or reassure them, tell them what they needed to hear back then, or shield them from the damaging comment or action or event. And I think this is a beautiful practice. But as Christians, we have an additional and incredibly powerful option. We can invite God into that moment. You might imagine God stepping into that memory, into that room, into that car, into that scene, whatever place that exile was formed, whatever memory or scene comes up in your mind that surrounds this wounded, exiled part. Allow God to step into that painful moment. Allow him to say the words that needed to be spoken or to do the thing that needed to happen. For some people, that may mean imagining Jesus kneeling beside the younger version of themselves. For others, it may mean imagining God wrapping that child up in his arms. And for others, it might simply mean hearing God speak truth over the distortion. Things like, "You are precious to me. You are loved more than you know. You are worthy of protection." Sometimes God's presence in that scene can even reframe the memory itself. Maybe the child was not actually as alone as they felt. Maybe God was present there all along. In fact, I've had some really powerful moments with some of my clients in this kind of exercise. One client in particular that I'm remembering had been raped as a teenager. And after working through several of her protector parts, we eventually arrived at the exile, the moment when this wounded part of her had formed. The protector part surrounding that exile had developed strategies to keep the pain from being felt again and again in her life. One part wanted to ignore and downplay the pain so it didn't feel so consuming. Another protector part acted as a kind of mask, keeping others from seeing the pain underneath. It was a way to keep people at a distance so they wouldn't see how deeply wounded she really was. Once we worked through each of those protectors, thanking them for what they had been trying to do, acknowledging the ways that they had tried to help, we gently asked them if they would be willing to step aside and allow my client to lead this inner expedition instead. And to those parts' credit, they were willing. They stepped aside and allowed us to interact directly with the exiled part that they had been guarding. And that exiled part carried a devastating belief. That part believed that she had been abandoned. Specifically, it believed that God had left her in that moment of violation when she was raped. That she was left all alone in the worst moment of her life. So we stepped back into that scene together. My client imagined kneeling beside her teenage self in that moment of violation. She was no longer alone in that memory. And then she imagined that God entered that scene. She imagined him wrapping both her present self and her younger self in his arms while the violation was happening. And together they wept. This became a powerful reframe for my client because suddenly she could see something that she had never seen before. She was not alone in the darkest moment of her life. God had been there with her all along, not stepping in to override human free will, but present nonetheless. And not just present, but also heartbroken, angered, protective, mourning what was happening to her. In that space, I asked my client a question. What do you imagine God would say to you, to this exile, in this moment of violation? And she said she imagined him saying something like this: "You are not alone. I'm here with you. I'm angry over this violation happening to you. I weep for the way this wounds you now and will continue to wound you throughout your life. And I also weep over the pain in the perpetrator's life that led him to this moment. I'm here with you. You are not alone in this. I will never leave you." It was a powerful moment for my client, a life-changing moment, because for the first time, she was able to see the whole truth of that moment. It was not okay what was happening to her. God not only mourned it and grieved it, but he was angry about that violation. And yet, at the same time, he also grieved over the pain the perpetrator must have been through to allow him to do such an act of evil. Recognizing that she had not actually been alone in that moment changed everything about how my client processed that pain. The memory still hurt. But instead of feeling like an open wound that got ripped open every time she thought about it, it began to feel more like a scabbed wound. Still tender, still part of her story, but no longer raw and exposed. Now, when that memory surfaced, that exiled part of her had somewhere safe to go, into the arms of God, where she was not alone. Now, sometimes there isn't a neat resolution when we bring God into our exiled parts. Truthfully, that kind of resolution can take years, and sometimes it may not even be fully possible this side of heaven. And when that's the case, we simply grieve with God. We invite him into that grief, not rushing to fix the pain, not rushing to make everything better, but allowing space to mourn what happened. I often think about a story from my friend and co-host, Georgia. Georgia has a very rich inner world, and once she described an internal scene to me that she experienced while processing some grief with God. She said she imagined the two of them in the Roman Colosseum, but it was empty, just the two of them, Jesus and Georgia. She was standing in the dirt of the arena, and scattered all around her were shattered pieces of her heart, like broken glass spread across the sand. And Jesus knelt down beside her in the dirt. She could see the dust caking his sandals and the hem of his robe. And one by one, he began picking up the pieces of her shattered heart. And each time he picked up a shard of glass, sometimes the jagged edge would cut his hand and he would bleed. But he kept picking them up. And every time he held one, he would say something like, I remember this one. I remember how much this hurt us. I remember how confused you were, how devastated we both were. And together they would cry over that one single piece of pain from her life, over that memory. And then Jesus would gently place that broken piece of heart back in the dirt, and he'd pick up another piece. And they would remember that pain together and cry again. And then he would pick up another, and then another, and another. And when she finished telling me this story, I told her something that stood out to me. I said, you know what really strikes me about this scene is that Jesus didn't glue your heart back together. Surely he has the power to do that. But in that moment, he seemed far less concerned with quickly fixing or taking away the pain than he was with just sitting with you in this, remembering it, honoring the pain, grieving it together. And I think that image captures something really important about what we're trying to do when we invite God into our inner world. We're not necessarily asking him to immediately take the pain away. We are not demanding that he glue our hearts back together right away. First, we just sit with him in it. We allow him to see the pain, to hold it, to mourn it with us. And that is something we can do with our exiled parts. We can return to them, sit with them, comfort them. And when we have to leave that internal space and return to our daily lives, we can imagine leaving that younger part in God's arms, safe, protected, comforted. This is the hope for our exiled parts. Not that the past disappears, not that every wound is instantly healed, but that those wounded places within us begin to experience the best thing available to us on this side of heaven, the presence of God. And in that presence, those wounded parts can begin to experience a kind of healing that is possible in this life. Comfort, perspective, the restoration of truth, and intimacy with the God who will never abandon us. Now, obviously, the example that I shared earlier about my client who was raped as a teenager is one of the more extreme examples of what this kind of inner parts work can look like. But the same approach applies to other kinds of wounds too. For example, in the story that I shared earlier about my dad not telling me something was spicy when I was 7, when I invited God into that memory with that exiled 7-year-old part of me that the boulder-like protector had been guarding for decades, I imagined God kneeling down to that little girl, holding her close and gently saying something like this: Your earthly father loves you, and he does the best he can to love and protect you. But he is fallen, just like you are. He can't offer you the perfect love and protection that you deserve, the kind of love that you were created for. You see, you were made to experience my perfect love and protection. And this moment when you felt unprotected by your dad had nothing to do with your worth. It had everything to do with the brokenness of this world. And as God said that to my 7-year-old exiled part, as he held that younger, wounded part of me, helping her understand that moment in context, helping her to see that the pain she felt in that moment was not evidence that she was unlovable or unworthy of protection. It was evidence that we live in a fallen world where even loving parents cannot perfectly reflect the protection that we were made for. And that presence, that perspective changes everything for how exiled parts carry our pain. Because now that I see, know, and understand this wounded young part of me, and now that I know how to place her in God's hands for comfort and perspective and protection, I no longer have to reorient my entire inner world to keep her pain from being triggered. Instead, when that pain does get triggered in this life, for example, when I feel the temptation to square up and protect myself from getting too close to someone or relying on someone, and that old boulder-like protector wants to come out again, I can pause. And instead of slipping back into those old patterns, I can go internal and say something like, I know you, old friend. I see you trying to protect that wounded 7-year-old part of me who once felt unprotected. Thank you. Thank you for what you've done for me and what you're still trying to do for me. But that little girl is safe in God's arms now. She understands something today she couldn't understand back then. That imperfect protection isn't a reflection of her own worth. It's just a reflection that we no longer live in Eden. And she knows now where her worth comes from. It comes from God, not from other people protecting her. So thank you, big, boulder-like, angry protector part, but you can stand down now. God and I will take it from here. You can rest. Now, at this point, some people might wonder, is this it? Is this where the IFS work ends? I mean, we know now how to recognize, understand, and validate our protector parts. We know how to access the wounded, exiled parts that they've been protecting, how to see their story, validate their pain, and place them in God's arms for comfort and protection and perspective. Place them in God's arms for perfect love. So the question naturally becomes, is this enough? Is there more to IFS for Christians than this? Technically, there is one more stage in the IFS model, and that is something called unburdening, which is a process in which parts release the burdens they've been carrying for years and are able to reintegrate into the inner system in healthier roles under the leadership of that core self. Now, personally, I don't have enough training in that stage of IFS to practice unburdening with my own clients. But in our next and final episode of this series, we will talk about the concept of unburdening and what that stage of the model looks like. But honestly, for me, this is often where the work ends with my clients. Because learning to see our parts, to know them, to understand them, to place them in the hands of God for protection, and then to partner with God in stewarding our inner lives, this process creates tremendous healing. Because this gives us what our wounded parts have always longed for, simply to be held again by the God we were made to walk with in Eden. Until next time, brother friends and sister friends, let's keep our hearts set on things above, even as we learn to tend to those delicate places within us that still long for Eden.